Hello everyone and welcome to the rebuild and assembly of the shock absorbers. Now in this video all 4 shock absorbers will be rebuilt again, unfortunately, but I will explain that issue further on. So to start off, the bushings of what is known as the stabilizer bar, anti-roll bar or sway bar have been installed, and next the end link arm bushings were installed as well. However, the reason for changing them was because the bushing set was cracked and torn due to age. Also, the bolt has been bent due to being subjected to a lot of past suspension issues, which is very common with these cars, and no Maserati specialist has ever noticed nor took care of it in 24 years. Nonetheless, this link has been changed with a slightly thicker rod, thicker washers, and beefier bushings. Moving on to the shock absorbers. Now I had to take the shock absorber apart because I needed to modify the top mount in order to weld longer bolts to cater for a strut bar. However, when I took it apart, I was shocked with what I found out. So the story journeys way back when I was concerned with the rebound of each shock absorber, which there wasn't any. When the car was pushed down, it stayed down, which was quite weird if you ask me. So I have had them sent to a Maserati specialist in order to have them properly rebuilt, only to be brought back with extreme disappointment. After the ridiculous amount of money spent on all 4 shock absorbers, the specialist took no responsibility for the rebuild quality, to which it was subpar to any cheap shock absorber alternative. So yet again, not to go into too much detail, I had decided to say screw it and had to spend twice the amount of money to have them properly rebuilt. Might as well went for fully adjustable racing coilovers. Since I'm already in too deep, I took a risk with these shocks and had them rebuilt myself. The top mount bearing was left with the old dried up grease. One of the top mounts had a grease cap washer and the other did not. So on a rainy day, the grease would have been easily contaminated and will eventually rust, resulting in a broken bearing. So what were the stupid mistakes the Maserati specialist made? The same old nylock shock absorber nut was reused, which I recognized it because it was the same one I pulled out, and nylock nuts can only be used once, otherwise they can come undone due to vibration. The internal damper was not the original, but was fitted with a cheap replacement, which at this point I'm not bothered with anymore. The dust cover plates were sheared and did not lock properly onto the shaft. One of the shocks had a spacer washer while the other did not, so a shock was already sitting higher than the other. The dust cover cap was re-welded and refaced at an engineering shop, which brought the diameter back to an acceptable size and placed back in position. All the shock absorber parts have been properly resprayed and not by means of an aerosol can. But the most irritating error made by the specialist was that the coil rubber seating was set wrong. This means that one shock had 2 upper rubber coil seats and the other shock had 2 lower rubber coil seats, which this means that one coil sat a bit more compressed and uncomfortably in its position, while the other sat a bit too loose and could easily rotate out of place while driving, because the rubber was not locking the coil properly in position. Now unfortunately, I had to make do with what I had since I could not afford to spend more money. But I tried my best to work efficiently. So as for new nylock nuts, these came only with new shocks. But I managed to find a company in America which had high tensile nuts of grade 10.9 rather than the normal 8.8 tensile nuts, which are also considered high tensile but not enough to cater for the amount of tension exerted by the shock absorber. This is a breakdown of the parts to be assembled, building our way up, which are the front shock absorber, coil spring, lower rubber spring seat, upper rubber spring seat, bump stop, upper spring base plate, dust cover and cap, the rubber mount with the thrust bearing, the assorted high tensile nylock nut, washer, spacer and grease cap washer, the top mount spacer, the brake support bracket, and finally the coil spring damper. Now, the coil spring damper is used to take the load off the coil when the car exhibits an excessive amount of nosedive while braking. I have taken this precaution because the car is very nose heavy, and in time it tends to sit low from the front side. Also, I do not want to repeat the same accident by hitting the sump when hard braking, so as an extra precaution, the car has an 8mm spacer to help the car to be raised from the front end. Also, the issue with the 8.8 tensile grade nuts is that they come a bit shorter than the 10.9 tensile grade nuts, so the more threads, the better. Moving on to the rear section. While disassembling the rear shock absorbers to change the top mount bolt for longer ones, I noticed that the rear shocks were assembled with a torn gaiter. So again, I had to take them apart to change and inspect these units. Not much could have gone wrong with the rear shocks, but to no surprise, it was done half-heartedly. So the shocks were resprayed for a clean look, new nuts were inserted, and the whole unit was reassembled with new parts once the longer bolts were welded in place. So once this procedure was finished, all 4 shock absorbers were installed back in the car. And the moral of the story is to never fully trust anyone who overhauls something without proper explanation for what has been overhauled.